You've most likely encountered forms when registering an account on a website or when filling out your address for something you've bought online. As a developer, you'll use HTML forms to capture user input. Capturing input is one thing, but the form also needs to ensure the data is usable. How can you ensure the user input is valid? For example, let's say you are building an online food delivery website. Say a user accidentally makes an error when entering the delivery address and the form accepts it, although the location does not exist. It will cause a very bad user experience when the food never arrives. This is where form validation comes in. Form validation is a process that ensures that the data entered by the user in a form is valid and conforms to rules defined by the developer. There are two methods of form validation: client-side validation and server-side validation. Client-side validation checks for errors as soon as they are typed into the form. This is done by the web browser or by JavaScript code and provides the user with immediate feedback. The client-side validation process starts by checking if a form has been filled out correctly. If there are no errors, the form will be submitted to the server for processing. However, if there are errors, an error message will alert the user of the invalid data and how to change it for successful submission. For example, you decide to use the input element with its type attribute set to email. If the user does not enter a valid email address, the web browser will display an error message informing them that the data they entered is not a valid email address. On the other hand, server-side validation checks for errors after the data has been submitted to the web server. Server-side validation is more secure because it prevents malicious users from tampering with your website's code and submitting invalid data to your server. When the form data is received by the web server, the backend will validate the data before processing it. This validation can run more complex checks, such as checking the data against a database or validating the data against business requirements. Most websites use both client-side and server-side validation to provide immediate feedback to users, but also to protect against malicious data submission and to ensure data integrity. Let's examine how HTML allows you to do simple client-side validation. HTML has several input types that are validated by the web browser. As demonstrated in the example, email is used for email addresses. Others include tel for telephone numbers, URL for URLs such as www.meta.com, date for date values, time for time values, number for numeric values, range for numeric values which have a minimum and maximum value, and color for color selection. Say, for instance, a user makes mistakes on a user account form when entering a telephone number and a URL. The browser will validate the entered data against the requirements of the input type and provide user feedback. Another example is the required attribute, which indicates that the user must supply a value to an input field. The web browser will alert a user if a required value is outstanding. And that's the basics of client and server-side validation of forms. You'll learn more about HTML validation capabilities later in this lesson.